So Steve is coordinating the initiative at UNECE on a passport. It's called the UN Transparency Protocol. It's a different type of passport. And we've been working together now for a year and a half, something like that, exchanging ideas, trying to understand the similarities, but also the differences between the UNTP DPP and the EU DPP. So both are DPPs, but they're not the same DPPs. They don't have exactly the same objectives. They don't have the same information IT architecture. But because they are so complementary, it makes sense to anticipate how the DPPs could be made interoperable as much as possible. So this is why with Steve, the SURPASS-2 team has been holding some technical discussions, brainstorming, and exchanging a lot, because it makes sense that there is a variety of DPP solutions, and they're more and more popping up all over the place. And so it makes sense to work towards making sure that these different DPPs are interoperable as much as possible. I wanted to share with everyone here this opportunity to question Steve on his work, not his own, but the team at UNECE working on this, and to explore the complementarities between the different DPPs. Okay, so I won't continue talking forever. I'm going to stay on. I'm going to mute myself and turn off my camera. Steve, if you want to share your screen, if you can. Victoria, can you?
I hope I can, yes.
Yeah, you should be able to.
Victoria's, yep, she's given me rights. Here we go.
Good.
All right. All right, well, thank you everyone for making, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. All right, so I think we have a 1 hour meeting, although I'm available to hang on longer if anyone wants to ask questions, and I will make sure there's time before the end of the 1 hour for plenty of questions. I'll start just by maybe doing a bit of positioning of how UNECE or UN in general fits into all this. So the UN has 5 regional commissions, and the UNECE is the Economic Commission for Europe. There's also one in Asia, South America, Africa, and so on. And the European Commission for Europe happens to host the Secretariat services for a small UN entity called UNCEFACT, which is actually a global entity. So even though it's housed in the UNECE Secretariat, it services all nations. And this little part of the UN has been very focused on cross-border trade standards for a very long time, something like 40 or 50 years. Even before digitalization, any of you that have seen, for example, an airway bill or an ocean bill of lading or something like that, you'll notice they all look identical apart from the logo in the corner. And that's because of UNECE recommendation number 1, called the layout key, which is, if you like, standards, not digital standards, but layout of paper document standards. That's how old this organization is. And then it went digital before the internet age with a technology called EDIFACT, which was the most ubiquitous digital technology at the time for the transfer of trade documents. And then since then, following the technology of the day, I suppose. It has an MOU with ITU and ISO, so jointly publishes global standards, but specifically around trade and compliance and facilitation. So why passports? Because sustainable trade is a recent focus. Historically, our focus was very much around border compliance and trade facilitation, things like trade finance and so on and so forth. And now, of course, sustainable trade is an important global agenda. And so there's some work ongoing towards digitalization of the sustainability aspects, particularly of cross-border trade. And that's where UNTP and recommendation 49 is. So you heard me mention earlier recommendation number 1, which is nearly as old as I am. which is paper layout. Recommendation number 49, just because it's the 49th one since number 1, is called transparency at scale. And just to clarify what a recommendation is, so it's a policy document issued by the UN to member states, which in most cases, not always, but most cases, is just voluntary guidance. In other words, there's no legal mandate associated with it. It's just recommendations for best practices. There have been previous ones that have had a significant impact, like the recommendation for trade single windows, that was number 33, and various others. Won't go into all the details, but recommendation 49 is called transparency at scale, and it's giving advice to nations about what they should do within their economy to facilitate traceable and transparent supply chains and participation broadly in a global sustainable supply chain transition. And so policy recommendations sometimes get turned into become the basis for what's called treaties, and those are more legally binding. We're not at that stage yet with this transparency at scale recommendation. It's just a document, and the way these documents work is they have a part 1. I'm not going to go through it in detail. I'll send you a link later, but this is the policy document, so not very technical. Talking about what is the challenge and the problem, and then a little bit about the shape of a solution strategy. There's a little diagram there I'll come to in a minute. And then section 2 in most of these policy documents, where do we get to? There's a few pages down. There are about 10 pages of policy recommendations. And then we get into part 2, which is design principles. So these are abstract of any particular technology implementation. They're basically best practice design principles for any traceable and transparent value chain initiative, right? And broken up into architecture, interoperability, and so on and so forth. You can see all that. And then the last part of this document is Annex 1, mentioning the United Nations Transparency Protocol. And you should think of that as the UN's implementation, if you like, of the design principles. So the purpose to keep this somewhat separate from the principles is to accommodate other important national and international initiatives. One very obvious one, of course, being the European Commission Digital Product Passport. So it would make kind of poor practice for the UN to say, hey, every nation that wants to do transparency at scale, you must implement UNTP, because that would be counter to various other initiatives, right? So it says, here's the challenge, here's the recommendations, here's the design principles, and here is one implementation of those design principles that we call UNTP. That's enough of the document, and we'll be able to share a link for those of you that would like to read it. I'll move on to the associated instrument, which is called the United Nations Transparency Protocol. This is much more concrete implementable. The policy document, abstract recommendations, UNTP, concrete, testable, implementable specifications. So I don't have a slideshow. What I'm going to do is walk through the website, because it's easy to find. You can just Google UNTP. It's usually the first hit. I'm just going to walk through the sections of it so that when you look at it yourself, if you choose to, you'll have a little bit of foresight about how it works, right? So click on any of the headings at the top and you get this menu on the left. You can see there's some generic stuff about what is UNTP, some business case stuff. I remind you again, this is a voluntary instrument, so very different to the EU DPP, which is guided by regulation and will mandate a certain technology, whatever comes out of JTC 24. UNTP is purely voluntary. And that's one of the reasons why we put some business incentives, business case. Why would you implement UNTP? Because the answer is not because some government says you must. It's because there's some business value in doing so. Anyway, so the first page here is just some very general guidance about what is UNTP. It's largely, I would say, an anti-greenwashing measure and designed to make sure that sustainability claims in international supply chains are confidently verifiable so that they retain value. This is really important, right? Because if sustainability claims are falsifiable easily, then everyone gets into a race to the bottom because you have to compete with someone who's cheating effectively, and the value of sustainable data, sustainable products diminishes. So a lot of UNTP is about how to ensure trust in the data that is associated with products that flow across the supply chain. And you'll see some differences I'll get to in a minute with compared to the EU regulation, because if you think about it, with a voluntary instrument, there isn't a law to back it up. Right? If you, under the EU regulation, if you're a market operator in Europe and you import a product and you issue a product passport, you're legally obliged. There's some legal due diligence obligation towards the accuracy of the data you put in the passport. And if you're discovered to be fibbing or faking, then there's a legal consequence, right? So if you like, the enforcement is what drives trust and confidence. Whereas with a voluntary instrument, there is no enforcement. So we have a different architecture for implying trust and confidence. Right? I'll just briefly show this diagram because it's also in the policy recommendation. One thing, we'll see this again in a minute, that's a difference between UNTP and the EU DPP is that although there is a digital product passport as part of UNTP, facility information, so factory or farm or mine site or whatever, is an equal class citizen. So UNTP has a product passport and a facility record. And you can see here the idea that in the various stages of the supply chain, there are organizations that issue facility data. And that's because for most voluntary instruments and most voluntary efforts, and we'll get into some of the pilots that are starting soon, the lower hanging fruit and the easiest approach to start to get a picture of a supply chain is not so much product constructed from product, it's facility that consumes products from other facilities or supplies, right? So UNTP products and facilities are equal class citizens. And then this orange stuff at the top is where the trust comes in. Because there's no regulatory instrument, UNTP leans a bit more heavily on things like third-party certifications and assessments. Right? So the idea of UNTP is to be able to trace this value chain from finished product back to primary production at both facility and product level, and with support of confident identity and third-party attestations. I won't go through all these. There's a governance structure. This diagram's a little bit busy. I'm sorry for that, but I'll just zoom in on it. So here you see UNCEFACT, which the board of directors, if you like, or the shareholders of UNCEFACT are member states. What UN does mostly has to be measurable against UN Sustainable Development Goals. This light blue bit is the UNTP working group that's producing specifications and maintains some tools that allow software systems and the like to test their implementations. This gray bit at the bottom here says industry extensions. That's important because UNTP, I suppose, is very similar to the European situation where there's a technical system specification from JDC 24, and then there's a bunch of delegated acts that are going to impose most likely different requirements for, let's say, steel or tires or textiles or whatever. Now, clearly, with UNTP, there aren't delegated acts. What there is an architecture that says there are some common features of a traceable and transparent supply chain architecture that are independent of commodity, but then there are some specific requirements of particular commodities, and they get very different, right? If it's food and agriculture, we have very different requirements to construction and steel, right? Weeks versus decades in terms of lifetime, for example, and very different data properties. So UNTP is organized as a core set of components and then an extensions architecture where industry associations usually, and I'll describe a few of them that we're working with, take the UNTP and define voluntary traceability and transparency data structures that are specific to their industry sector: copper, textiles, mining, and so on. All right, so that's the gray stuff down here. You can read about that on the governance page. Meetings are, it's voluntary expert contributions under the UN. Nobody's paid to develop anything, very similar to, I suppose, to ISO and Senelec, except that the UN tends to work much more publicly. So even though we're ongoing, we haven't finished yet, we're not in the final release yet, you can find on this page 2 years of meetings, all with the full video and transcript and summary. Right, so if anything's interesting, you can look at that. I'm going to move on to the technical specification bit now, and I want to focus on this diagram for a little bit. I hope everyone can see that. So in the middle here, the data objects that UNTP defines. If you remember, I said product passports and facility records are equal class citizens. That's why we got these two green blobs here. One is a set of metadata and claims about the sustainability characteristics of products, and another one about facilities. As you'll certainly know, a lot of sustainability performance is actually managed and governed and tested at the facility level, not the product level. So for example, EU deforestation requirement imposes an obligation on farms and other facilities like mine sites and so on, irrespective of the products that come out of them. It's about the facility itself, right? So across any sustainability topic, you very often find that the performance characteristics you care about are distributed between product level and facility level. So that's why they're both important. This slightly yellow colored thing on the right here, called a digital conformity credential, is a standard data structure for a third-party attestation and assessment. So this is the thing that actors in the supply chain, when they get certified by third parties, if those certifications are digital, then they can be algorithmically compared to the claims in the facility records and passports. Right, so that the self-assessed claim in a passport or a facility can be backed up by a third-party assessment in a conformity credential. That's what the yellow thing on the right is for. The blue thing on the left, traceability event, separated for a few reasons. One, because events like a repair of a battery after it's issued to market, or feeding a cow in a feedlot after it's released from the farm and before it gets to the abattoir, often happen at a different time to the production of the product that's described by a product passport. Also, these traceability events tend to contain more sensitive information. For example, a transformation event will say, this battery is made from these constituent parts, or this steak cuts came from this herd of cows, right? And so those sort of events are revealing supply chain customer-supplier relationships, and they tend to be more sensitive. And what we find is that there's a very different appetite from industry to industry and within actors inside an industry for the balance that each actor wants to take in a voluntary system between transparency and confidentiality. Some are really quite willing to share a remarkable amount of detail about their value chain. You can go to the Adidas website, for example, and have a look at their entire value chain. And some others treat it as a commercial secret. And again, because UNTP is a voluntary instrument, the basic principle is that we provide the tools to allow every actor to make their own choice, their own individual choice between transparency and confidentiality, and basically give them tools to hide what they need to hide and let the market pull more and more transparency is basically the UN strategy. That's another reason to keep this blue thing separated, whereas the other things tend to be a bit more public. Box on the top is worth talking about. One of the challenges we have, again, is that because this is global, working in all kinds of different sectors and all kinds of commodities, we want to build, in fact, more than want to, we have to build on top of existing product identifier schemes. One example, the cows in Australia, and the sheep for that matter, are identified by an RFID tag in their ear. It's been in use for decades. There's 100 million of them in circulation. Nobody's going to put a QR code on the side of a cow or change the RFID tags in their ear. So we need an architecture where we can leverage the ID of the product or animal or whatever it is as it exists today and then still be able to resolve digital information about it. So very often that's not a QR code. So this identity resolver component of UNTP is answering the question of when I've got an idea of a thing, how do I find digital data about the thing? And this is a core idea behind UNTP, because not only does it allow us to build on top of existing identifier schemes, which we have to do, but also it helps with some robustness in the data exchange architecture, right? Because take, for example, a cow leaving an Australian farm and going to a feedlot, and then going to a sale yard, and then to an abattoir. It's the abattoir that cares about the characteristics of the cow, but there's two actors in between the abattoir and the farmer, the sale yard and the feedlot. And if we depended on data flowing from actor to actor to actor, then the chains would break very quickly. Whereas if the abattoir can scan the RFID in the cow's ear and get the livestock passport, it doesn't matter how many sale yards or feedlots the cow has been through. And this pattern repeats all over long value chains, right? Copper anodes produced from a refinery are often bought and sold 3 or 4 times in one consignment while traveling. And so what you care about is the receiving facility that's going to process that copper anode, being able to get data about it and not have to know who to ask about who sold it to who sold it to who sold it to who, right? So this idea of, given an idea of a thing, I can get data about a thing, is quite fundamental to UNTP. It makes it scalable and builds on top of existing systems. The other key thing I'd like to point out is the little bit in the top right of that top box where it says humans or machines. So again, if we have an architecture that across long value chains requires actors to have the same level of technical maturity, I can't give you a digital product passport unless you're technically ready to view the digital product passport or use the digital product passport because you're machine integrated. Then we have another broken supply chain very quickly, right? So another key principle is that every UNTP data object, those 4 things in the middle, product passport, facility record, et cetera, are always both human readable and machine readable at the same time. I often, when I'm explaining this to business people, and I know there's a lot of technical people here, so I might be oversimplifying, but I use the analogy of a travel passport. It's got a chip in it, but it's also human readable. You scan it at a smart gate, the machine reads it, you show it to the hotel desk, the human reads it. It's the same thing though, right? And so all these UNTP objects work like that. They must be human readable and machine readable so that the issuer does not have to care or know whether the verifier is technically capable or not. Okay, so that's a few parts of it. The red stuff on the left, I won't go into too much detail, but this is the security and confidentiality part of UNTP. It does build on verifiable credentials as the carrier for these data objects. It also defines a mechanism to link self-sovereign identifiers, DIDs, many of you will know what that is, to authoritative registers. Right? So the issuer of a passport might be some DID that a verifier doesn't know, but if that DID is anchored to, let's say, an Australian business register, then that adds identity confidence. Or it could be to a trademark register or whatever, right? So the idea of connecting the identifiers, these self-sovereign identifiers, to authoritative identifiers for trust purposes is another aspect of UNTP. And the top left is decentralized access control. So if I encrypt the blue thing, how do I get the decryption keys for the blue thing, for example? The decentralized access control. Now, before I move off this diagram, the bit at the bottom says understand the data, this thing called a sustainability vocabulary catalog. Again, in UNTP, we have a slightly different challenge to the European Commission, because European Commission is going to publish delegated acts that say, these are the rules for tires, or these are the rules for textiles, or whatever, right? We're not defining any of those rules in UNTP. What we're recognizing is that there are already, I was going to say hundreds, but I think the reality is thousands of sustainability schemes, sometimes industry-based, sometimes de jure standards bodies, sometimes regulatory, that define rules for about how you measure carbon intensity, or how you measure deforestation, or how you measure social welfare, or whatever it is. There are literally hundreds or thousands of them. And because we don't pick a winner, what we need is a way for a scheme owner, which could be a regulator or could be the Responsible Business Alliance, or Meat and Livestock Australia defines rules about how to measure carbon intensity of cows. There are so many of them. All we need to do is provide a consistent way for these rules to be published such that they can be unambiguously referenced. Right? Because if I'm going to make claims in my digital product passport that my cow has this much carbon intensity, or my copper does not come from a conflict zone, then I need to be able to say not just the claim, but also the rule base or reference or criteria against which I'm making the claim, right? So that they can be understood. So that's what the sustainability vocabulary catalog is. It's basically an instruction set for scheme owners to publish their rules so that they're unambiguously referenceable by both the green thing and the yellow thing, right? So the same criteria might be referenced in a claim in a passport as well as in a third-party assessment in a conformity credential. Okay, so I've dwelled quite a long time on that diagram because it's all the key components, right? Let's go quickly and see how here's one that's a little bit more detailed, kind of an abstract picture of what's in the product passport, facility record, conformity credential, and so on. I won't dwell on that one too much. And then one of the key ideas also of UNTP is that we want to avoid the need for a supply chain actor to have to reach and collaborate and coordinate across multi-levels of the supply chain, because that never scales, right? We've been working with some very large brands worldwide who, no matter how big a household name they are and how big a company they are, they can't reach back to the farm or the mine because it's too far away. And even if they did, the farmer or the miner, let's say it's a copper mine, if they're asked by a battery manufacturer for some information, they basically don't care. They're going to say, go away. I sell bulk copper. I don't care what's in your battery most of the time, right? So we need an architecture where each actor can do their own selfish thing for their own market segment in such a way that the picture can still be constructed, and particularly cross industry boundaries. So for example, a car maker might be able to go back to a farm because they care about the leather sustainability in the seat. So yeah, this picture is basically showing each actor doing their thing, but because of the identifiers in these objects, it's possible to build linked data trails, assuming you've got access to the information. So I'll just skip through, so you'll see down here on the left, more details about all of these technical specifications. So for example, if you pick on the digital product passport one, you'll see that same diagram, some requirements, a little bit of a more detailed data model, and then some guidance and some snippets, all the usual stuff you'd expect to see about a technical object and a sample, right? So if I click on that sample, hopefully it'll open a credential viewer and show us, in this case, a battery passport. So this is what I mean by human readable and machine readable, right? So we're looking at a human rendering of this JSON data object in this case. And you'll see the same examples for conformity credentials, traceability events, facility records, and so on. Yeah. Now, I'll just skip on to this next part here called best practices. And I think Carolyn said this as well, right? What you've seen is a whole bunch of separate credentials or data objects that might be discovered in the value chain. But if I'm really trying to do my due diligence assessment of my value chain, I care not only about whether this or that individual credential is valid, but whether the contextual connection across them is valid, right? So for example, I got a digital product passport and it's valid, and it makes some claims about, I don't know, the carbon intensity of some copper. I find a digital conformity credential as well. But if it's not about the same copper, or it's not about the same, or it's not assessed against the same criteria, then the conformity credential doesn't substantiate the claims in the passport. right? So there are very many cases where you need to look at 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 credentials and actually assess the relationship between the data in them in a kind of a connected graph. Here's a picture which I still have to update, Carolyn, with the feedback you gave me. I haven't done it yet. That is actually coming out of one of our pilots with an organization called the Responsible Business Alliance, which is an American, well, it's global really, but you look at a lot of brand names there, a lot of American brands there, who have been supporting their members for, I think, at least 20 years now, with compliance against things like the Dodd-Frank Act, which is an American act about supply chain due diligence for critical minerals and conflict zones. But what you find is around the world, large corporates, irrespective of regulatory environments, are concerned about their social license, as well as their regulatory obligations, which are many and varied. And to support that, are looking for greater traceability and transparency in value chains. And many of them have experienced some pain over the last, I don't know, few years with pilot experiments that never seem to scale, never seem to go anywhere, very often because they were technical platform centric. I've seen too many pilots where a technology vendor, and I know there's several in the room here, no disrespect intended, say things like, I'll be able to give you a complete map of the value chain if all actors in the supply chain put their data in my platform. Now, if you think about that for any length of time, you realize it can't possibly scale. Right? It's kind of analogous to saying, I'm sorry, I can't trade with you unless you open a bank at an account at my bank. The world doesn't work like that. There are thousands of banks, and yet we can pay each other. Right? So very similar with UNTP. It's a protocol, not a platform. And all our pilots are focused on proving interoperability across multiple platforms. We don't do any pilots with a single technology vendor because that defeats the purpose. And also our pilots are business-led, not technology-led, right? So it's taking let's say a major corporate and working through their supply chain without concern about what software systems they're using, more about who is in your value chain, and proving that any software system chosen by any of those actors can be interoperable. And so that's what this pilot with the Responsible Business Alliance will do. Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to give you the names yet of the OEMs that are participating, but if you go to the Responsible Business Alliance website and look at the member list, what I can say is the electronic and electrical and electronic brands that are participating are household names that every one of you will know intimately, probably using their products, and the automotive the same. So they're quite substantial organizations that are looking to exploit UNTP to prove that they can meet their scalable transparency and traceability initiatives. And our pilots will basically take little snippets of this diagram and say, okay, let's pilot this bit or that bit, and then start to join them up into connected pilots. All right. I'll come to implementation guidance in a minute. There's a couple of interesting bits down here. You remember I said that UNTP is a core common set of components that are extended to meet industry-specific needs, textiles, agricultural. So this here is a description of the methodology, how that works, the rules, if you like, of extensions, and a register of current extensions. I expect a few more to be listed soon, but there's the Responsible Business Alliance one, which is about electrical, electronic goods. There's one in construction. There's one in agriculture. There's one starting in critical minerals and coming. And then again, because our pilots are very business centric, obviously at some point in the pilot, we need to, rubber needs to hit the road and some implementation needs to happen. And for that, what we need is a number of software providers who have committed to implement UNTP so that their products become options for the business actors who are participating in pilots. So you can see a little list here of various software platforms that have committed to implement. And I hope that some of the people on this call who are working towards making tools for the European digital product passport will see value in also having a look at UNTP and perhaps registering your interest. It's not a legally binding commitment, but there's a little page here under implementations register where there's instructions. Yeah, basically create an issue, describe your product, which UNTP specifications you want to implement, and you'll get reviewed and then listed on this page and be there for potential business pilot actors to have a look at. So I encourage you to have a look and think about that. It's probably worth mentioning that the European market is about 15% of world trade. That most of our we have a fair bit of activity with UNTP in the Americas and in Asia, and a fair bit of interest in how can UNTP be interoperable with Europe, and also its reach goes much further generally up the value chain, right, to primary production of farms and mines. So in terms of scope, if we go back to this transparency graphs picture, this thing again down here, right? Every one of these boxes has some UNTP kind of artifacts, whether it's a facility record or a product passport or an RMAP stands for responsible mining credential or certificate of analysis. In this picture, there are not too many that are European regulatory objects. So if you like, the scope of UNTP should hopefully work very in a very aligned way with the EU delegated acts, but should also allow European actors to reach deeper into their supply chain, mostly international supply chains, to give them more confidence of the due diligence claims that they make. And, so I'll probably, I think, maybe stop there. There is the site you're looking at is just a GitHub Pages generated site, and you can go and look at all the open issues. There's a roadmap here. It says we're a little bit late we're on 0.5. Those sample credentials I showed you are all 0.5 release. 0.6 is a bit overdue. A few more tickets to close before we get to 0.6, and then 0.7, and then 1.0. So later this year. And during after we release 0.6, I expect we'll start to use it for some of these more recent pilots around critical minerals and automotive and electronic goods and so on and so forth.